What's the hardest decision a parent could ever make? My 4-year-old daughter Daniela came into the kitchen crying after preschool and said, "Daddy, I don't want to go to school anymore. They keep punching my belly." I immediately knelt down and saw real fear in her eyes. She was holding her belly, and my wife Ruby rushed over as I gently asked Daniela to explain what was happening at school. She said during nap time someone kept hitting her stomach. It happened almost every day and made her feel sick. When I asked who was doing it, she couldn't say because the room was dark during nap time. The next morning I met with the preschool director, Mrs. Henderson. She seemed genuinely shocked and promised to investigate immediately. They would have a teacher stationed right next to Daniela during nap time and review all their procedures. But Daniela came home that afternoon still complaining about stomach pain. We took her to see Dr. Weber, who did a thorough examination. He found no bruising or signs of physical trauma. Her abdomen felt normal and blood work came back fine. He suggested it might be anxiety or possibly acid reflux and prescribed some mild medication. But I knew my daughter wasn't making this up. Over the next 2 weeks, the preschool insisted no one was touching Daniela. They'd moved her mat next to the teacher's desk and watched her constantly. But she kept coming home with the same story. Ruby and I were at our wits' end trying to figure out what was happening to our little girl. Ruby suggested installing a baby monitor in Daniela's room. Maybe she was having night terrors or sleep disturbances that she was confusing with school experiences. I agreed because we needed answers. We set up the camera without telling either of the kids about it. The first few nights showed nothing unusual. I started leaving the monitor on during the day too when the kids played upstairs. That's when I began noticing odd behavior from our 7-year-old son, Walker. Walker would go into Daniela's room frequently when she was playing. Sometimes he'd just stand in the doorway watching her. Other times he'd get very close to her and she'd push him away. It seemed like normal sibling behavior, but something about his expression bothered me. 5 days after installing the monitor, I was reviewing footage from the previous night. Around 2 a.m., Walker had entered Daniela's room. He stood by her bed, then reached down and punched her in the stomach. Hard. Daniela curled up in her sleep and whimpered, but didn't wake fully. Walker hit her 2 more times before leaving. I felt sick as I called Ruby over. We watched in shock as I showed her multiple instances of Walker hitting Daniela over the past week. Sometimes at night, sometimes during afternoon naps when we thought both kids were sleeping. Our son had been systematically hurting his sister for weeks. We confronted Walker that morning. He denied it until we showed him the video. Then he just shrugged and said he didn't know why he did it. No remorse, no explanation. Ruby started crying while I tried to understand how we'd missed this. Walker had always been a good kid who did well in school and had friends. We immediately made an appointment with Dr. Roberts, a child psychologist. She met with Walker several times that week. He was cooperative but couldn't explain his behavior. He said sometimes he just felt like he had to hurt Daniela. The compulsion would come over him and he couldn't stop himself. Dr. Roberts recommended keeping the siblings separated and possibly medication. She wanted to rule out any neurological issues with brain scans. We implemented strict supervision and door alarms. Walker seemed to understand he'd done wrong, but we caught him trying to sneak into Daniela's room twice more. During this stressful time, I was going through the monitor footage obsessively looking for patterns. That's when I noticed something odd in recordings from several weeks ago. Our cat Pepper appeared in some of the daytime footage in Walker's room. We'd assumed she ran away 2 months ago when she disappeared. I watched Walker playing with Pepper normally at first, but then in footage from early March I saw him picking her up roughly. In another clip, he was pulling her tail while she tried to get away. The last footage of Pepper showed Walker carrying her into his closet. She never appeared on camera again after that. My hands were shaking as I went up to Walker's room. He was at school, and Ruby had taken Daniela to a playdate. I opened his closet and started moving boxes and toys. Behind his sports equipment, I found a small cardboard box sealed with tape. The smell hit me before I even opened it. Inside was Pepper's collar and what remained of her body wrapped in a towel. She'd been dead for weeks based on the condition. I stumbled backward, feeling like I might vomit. Our 7-year-old son had killed our family cat and hidden her in his closet, and we'd had no idea. I called Ruby immediately and told her to keep Daniela away from the house. Then I called Dr. Roberts with this discovery. She said to call the police and not touch anything else. This went beyond normal childhood behavioral issues. Walker had shown calculated violence toward animals, which often escalated to humans. When Walker came home from school, I was waiting with 2 police officers and a social worker. He saw them, and his face went completely blank. No surprise, no fear, just empty. As they explained why they were there, he tilted his head and looked directly at me. "Did you find the other box too?" My eyes went wide. Detective Williams stepped forward immediately and put his hand on Walker's shoulder, while Ms. Garcia pulled out her phone and started making calls. The detective told Walker to stay right where he was, and then looked at the other officer who nodded and headed straight upstairs. I stood there frozen, my brain trying to process what my 7-year-old had just said about another box. Walker sat down on the couch and started swinging his feet back and forth, watching all of us move around him with that same empty look on his face. The detective asked him where the other box was, but Walker just tilted his head and said he forgot, like he was talking about a misplaced toy. Missy Garcia finished her call and told me they needed to treat Walker's room as a potential crime scene and that nobody should go in there until they finished searching. I watched the officers put on gloves and head upstairs while Walker picked at a loose thread on the couch cushion, completely calm like this was just another normal afternoon. They started going through everything in his room systematically, pulling out drawers, checking under furniture and bagging items. I could hear them moving things around up there while Walker hummed quietly to himself on the couch. Missy Garcia sat down next to him with a notepad and started asking him questions about school and friends, but his answers were all short and flat. After about 20 minutes, the detective called down for me to come upstairs but to stay in the doorway. When I got there, they had Walker's whole room torn apart with everything spread out on the floor. Under his bed, wrapped in one of Daniela's old pillowcases, they'd found a shoebox that made my stomach turn. Inside were about a dozen of Daniela's hair ties that we thought she'd lost, several of her drawings that had gone missing from the fridge, and a piece of notebook paper covered in Walker's messy handwriting. The detective held it up so I could read it, and I saw it was a list of rules about hitting Daniela, things like not, when mom is home, and only 3 times, and wait 2 days between. My legs felt weak as I realized my son had been planning and tracking his attacks on his little sister, like some kind of sick experiment. Ms. Garcia came upstairs and looked at what they'd found, then immediately got back on her phone with her supervisor. She told them about the evidence and said they needed to implement an emergency safety plan right away because Walker posed an imminent risk to his sister. I heard car doors outside and looked out the window to see Ruby pulling into the driveway with Daniela in the back seat. I ran downstairs and out the front door to meet them before they could come inside. Daniela jumped out of the car excited to tell me about her playdate, but started crying when she saw my face. Ruby asked what was wrong and why there were police cars in our driveway. I told Daniela to go play on her swing set for a minute while I talked to Mommy. Once she was out of earshot, I whispered to Ruby about what they'd found in Walker's room, the box with Daniela's things and the rules he'd written. Her face went white and she grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. She kept shaking her head and saying no over and over while I explained about the police searching his room. Missy Garcia came outside with a folder full of papers and walked over to us while Daniela played on the swings, completely unaware of what was happening. She explained that based on what they'd found and Walker's behavior, they needed to remove him from the home immediately for Daniela's safety. She said we could either agree to voluntary placement for psychiatric evaluation or they would pursue an emergency involuntary hold through the court. Ruby started crying and asking if we could just watch him closer or get more locks, but Ms. Garcia shook her head. She said the evidence showed planned, systematic abuse, and that Walker needed immediate professional intervention in a secure setting. I looked through the living room window and saw Walker still sitting on the couch, now playing with a toy car he'd found between the cushions. My hands shook as I signed the papers Ms. Garcia put in front of me, each signature feeling like I was signing away my son. Ruby signed too, tears dropping onto the pages as she wrote her name. Ms. Garcia called for the transport team and said they'd be here within the hour to take Walker to the children's psychiatric unit at the county hospital. We went back inside where Walker was still on the couch, rolling the toy car back and forth on his leg. When we told him he'd be going to stay at a special hospital for a while, he just asked if they had a TV there. The transport team arrived in a van with the hospital logo on the side and 2 people in scrubs got out. They were nice to Walker, talking to him about the hospital and what his room would be like. He packed a small bag with clothes and toys while they watched, moving slowly and carefully like nothing was urgent. When it was time to go, Walker picked up his bag and walked to the van without any fuss. He didn't cry or ask to stay or even seem upset about leaving. As they helped him into the van, he looked back at me and said he'd be good now in the same flat tone he'd used when talking about Pepper. The van pulled away, and I stood in the driveway watching until it turned the corner and disappeared. That night at the hotel, Daniela kept asking where Walker was and why we couldn't go home. She wanted her stuffed animals from her room and didn't understand why we had to stay somewhere else. Ruby and I took turns staying awake even though we knew Walker was at the hospital, both of us jumping at every little noise in the hallway. I kept checking the door locks and looking out the window at the parking lot, unable to shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Daniela finally fell asleep between us in the big hotel bed, but Ruby and I just lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd missed all the signs and what would happen to our family now. The next morning, my phone rang while Daniela was eating cereal at the hotel's breakfast area. Dr. Roberts said she'd been on calls with the hospital team since 6 a.m., sharing everything about Walker's sessions with her. She mentioned something called conduct disorder, with callous, unemotional traits that matched Walker's behavior patterns perfectly. The hospital psychiatrist wanted all her notes and video recordings from their appointments to build a complete profile. I wrote down everything she said on the hotel notepad, while Ruby fed Daniela pieces of waffle and tried to act normal. Around 10 o'clock, Detective Williams knocked on our hotel room door, carrying a thick folder and a recording device. He sat at the small table and asked us to go through every single thing we'd noticed about Walker over the past year. We spent 3 hours describing the dead birds in the yard that Ruby had blamed on cats, the way Walker would stare at Daniela when she cried like he was studying her reaction, how he'd broken his friend's toy at a birthday party, then acted confused when the kid got upset. Williams wrote pages of notes and kept asking for more details about dates and times and specific behaviors. When we got to the part about finding Pepper's body, his pen stopped moving, and he just looked at us. He said they were reviewing whether criminal charges were possible, but prosecuting a 7-year-old was basically unheard of in our state. The next day, we had to go back to the house to get more clothes since we'd only packed for one night. Walking through the front door felt wrong, like entering someone else's home after they died. I went upstairs to pack while Ruby stayed downstairs with Daniela, who was scared to be back. In Daniela's room, I saw things I'd never noticed before, even though I'd been in there hundreds of times. Deep scratches on her doorframe right at Walker's height like he'd been trying to get in when it was locked. Small tears in 3 of her stuffed animals that looked deliberate, not from normal wear. A broken crayon hidden behind her toy box that had been snapped into pieces. I took pictures of everything for the detective, then packed 2 suitcases full of Daniela's things. The psychiatric unit called that afternoon while we were driving back to the hotel. The doctor said Walker was following all their rules perfectly and hadn't caused any problems with staff or other patients. But she was concerned because he showed zero emotional response to being away from his family. Most kids his age would be crying for their parents, or at least asking about them constantly. Walker just wanted to know what time meals were served and if they had video games in the rec room. She said this kind of detachment was extremely unusual, even in children with severe behavioral issues. That night, after Daniela finally fell asleep, Ruby completely broke down in the hotel bathroom. She kept switching between sobbing that Walker was just a little boy who needed help and being terrified of what he might do if he came home. She asked me over and over what we did wrong and how we could have raised someone capable of hurting his sister and killing our cat. I held her while she cried, but I didn't have any answers because I'd been asking myself the same questions. She said maybe we were too strict, or maybe not strict enough, or maybe we should have noticed sooner. The guilt was eating both of us alive, even though Dr. Roberts kept saying this wasn't our fault. 2 days later, Mrs. Henderson called to check on Daniela and see how our family was doing. She said the whole preschool staff was thinking about us and wanted to help any way they could. They'd have extra counselors on hand whenever Daniela was ready to come back and would work with whatever schedule we needed. She also mentioned that looking back, there had been a few incidents with Walker when he'd attended their summer camp 2 years ago. Nothing major enough to document, but a pattern of him not understanding when he'd hurt other kids' feelings. She wished she'd said something sooner, but it had seemed like normal kid stuff at the time. Dr. Roberts set up a meeting for us with Dr. Finn Dorsey, who specialized in children with severe behavioral problems. His office was in a medical building 40 minutes from the hotel, and the walls were covered with degrees and certifications I'd never heard of. He spent 2 hours reviewing everything we documented about Walker, including the videos from the baby monitor and the police reports. He said we were dealing with something way beyond typical childhood aggression or even standard conduct disorder. Walker's systematic abuse of Daniela combined with his complete lack of remorse suggested something much more serious. He explained that some children are born with neurological differences that affect how their brains process empathy and impulse control. These kids could learn to follow rules through consequences, but they'd never actually feel bad about hurting others the way normal people do. Walker's calculated behavior and ability to hide it for so long showed a level of planning that was extremely concerning in someone so young. 3 days later, we had our first supervised visit with Walker at the hospital. The visit room had toys and books, but also cameras in every corner, and a staff member who stayed the whole time. Walker walked in wearing hospital pajamas and immediately asked when he could come home, like he was asking about the weather. When I explained he needed to get better first, and the doctors were helping him learn to be safe, he just nodded and asked if I'd brought his Nintendo Switch. He didn't ask about Daniela or Ruby, or even seem to notice that his mom had been crying. The therapist tried to get him to talk about his feelings, but he just kept asking about video games and when he could have his regular clothes back. After the visit, the neurologist wanted to run brain scans to rule out any tumors or lesions that might explain Walker's behavior. We spent 6 hours at the hospital while Walker got MRIs and EEGs and other tests I couldn't pronounce. He laid perfectly still in the machines without complaining, which the tech said was unusual for kids his age. Most 7-year-olds needed sedation, or at least constant reassurance, but Walker just followed instructions like a tiny robot. The whole time I kept hoping they'd find something wrong that could be fixed with surgery or medication, but deep down I knew we weren't going to get that kind of simple answer. The results came back 2 days later, and Dr. Dorsey called us in to review them together. Every single scan showed a normal 7-year-old brain with no tumors or lesions or anything that could explain Walker's behavior. Dr. Dorsey pulled up the images on his computer screen and pointed to different areas while explaining that kids like Walker had differences in how their brains worked, not how they looked. The parts that controlled empathy and impulse control functioned differently, even though they appeared normal on scans. He said this was typical for children with these kinds of behavioral issues and meant we were dealing with something that couldn't be fixed with surgery or simple medication. That night, Daniela woke up screaming 3 times, and when I went to comfort her, she was soaking wet from wetting the bed again. She hadn't had accidents in over a year, but now it was happening every night since Walker had been taken to the hospital. During the day, she'd flinch whenever Ruby or I moved too fast near her, and she started hiding behind furniture when anyone came to the door. My little girl, who used to run up and hug everyone, was now scared of her own shadow. Ms. Garcia saw how Daniela was struggling and made some calls to find someone who specialized in helping young kids process trauma. She got us an appointment with Natalie Stein, who worked specifically with preschool-aged victims of abuse. The first session was at Natalie's office, which looked more like a playroom than a therapy space with dolls and toys everywhere. Daniela spent the whole hour just playing with a dollhouse, while Natalie sat on the floor nearby, not pushing her to talk but just being present and safe. Meanwhile, the insurance company started making things difficult about keeping Walker in the psychiatric unit. They sent a letter saying that since he was stable and following rules in the controlled environment, he didn't meet their criteria for continued inpatient coverage. Ms. Garcia had to file emergency paperwork and get letters from 3 different doctors explaining that Walker was only safe because of the locked unit and constant supervision. She spent hours on the phone arguing with insurance representatives who'd never met Walker, but thought they knew better than his doctors. Detective Williams called that afternoon to update us on their investigation of Walker's room. They'd found a notebook hidden under his mattress filled with drawings of hurt animals and stick figures in various states of distress. There was also a list of kids from his class with check marks next to 5 names. When I asked what the checks meant, Williams just said they were still investigating, but suggested we might want to notify those families' parents. 2 days later, we got a call from Jade Hansen at Pine Ridge Residential Treatment Center. She was direct from the start, explaining their program worked with children who had severe behavioral disorders, including those with limited empathy. She said they could teach Walker to follow society's rules and control his impulses through strict structure and consequences, but they couldn't make him feel things he wasn't capable of feeling. The facility was 2 hours away, and kids typically stayed for 6 months to 2 years, depending on their progress. During our weekly family therapy session, Ruby finally broke down and admitted she'd been noticing strange things about Walker for over a year. She'd found dead birds in our backyard multiple times, but convinced herself the neighbor's cat was bringing them over. She'd seen Walker watching other kids at the playground with an odd expression, like he was studying them instead of playing. She'd even caught him pulling legs off bugs in the garage, but thought all boys went through that phase. Dr. Roberts helped her understand that she hadn't caused this by ignoring the signs, and that many parents missed early warning signs because they couldn't imagine their child being capable of such things. That night, I dragged a blanket and pillow into the hallway between the kids' rooms, even though Walker was locked in a hospital unit 30 miles away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to guard Daniela's door. Every little sound made me jump up to check on her. I'd peek in to make sure she was still breathing, still safe, still there. The exhaustion was crushing, but I couldn't stop the constant checking and rechecking. Ruby found me there at 3 in the morning and tried to convince me to come back to our bed, but I couldn't leave my post. Walker's second-grade teacher sent an email saying she was shocked by the news because he'd always been such a polite student. She mentioned that looking back, she did notice he seemed to watch the other children's emotional reactions very carefully, almost like he was taking notes on how to respond appropriately. When kids cried on the playground, Walker would pat their back, but his face stayed blank. When everyone laughed at something funny, Walker would laugh too, but a beat too late, like he was copying them. She said she'd thought he was just shy, or maybe on the spectrum, but never imagined anything this serious. 3 days later, Ruby and I attended our first support group meeting for parents of children with severe behavioral disorders. The meeting was in a church basement with about 12 other parents sitting in a circle of folding chairs. Everyone looked exhausted and defeated in the same way we did. One mom talked about her 10-year-old daughter who'd been in residential treatment for 3 years after trying to poison her younger brother. A dad shared how his son had seemed perfect until age 8 when they found him torturing neighborhood cats. Another couple described years of therapy and medication trials with no real improvement in their child's lack of empathy. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone, but also confirmed what Dr. Dorsey had been trying to tell us. This wasn't something that would just go away with the right treatment. These families had been dealing with this for years and would continue dealing with it for the rest of their lives. Their kids had learned to follow rules to avoid consequences, but never developed real feelings for others. The support group leader talked about grief and how we needed to mourn the child we thought we had while learning to parent the child we actually had. The hospital psychiatrist started Walker on medication the next morning. She called to explain it would help control his impulses, but warned us not to expect miracles. The pills could reduce the urges to hurt others, but they couldn't create empathy that wasn't there. Walker took them without complaint, swallowing each dose while the nurse watched. 2 days later, we had our first supervised visit since his admission. Walker sat across from us in a small room with a therapist watching from the corner. He looked the same, but something in his eyes seemed even more empty than before. When I asked how he was doing, he listed off his daily schedule like reading from a script. Breakfast at 7, group therapy at 9, lunch at noon, more therapy, dinner, then bed. Ruby tried to hug him, but he stayed rigid in her arms. Then Walker mentioned he'd been thinking about Pepper. He said he was sorry she was gone. My heart jumped for a second until I asked if he understood why what he did was wrong. He tilted his head and recited exactly what the therapist must have told him. Hurting animals is against the rules and makes people sad. No real understanding, just memorized words. The therapist nodded like this was progress, but I felt sick. Meanwhile, Daniela had started seeing Natalie twice a week for trauma therapy. During one session, she drew our family with crayons. Ruby and I were stick figures holding hands. Daniela was between us with a big smile, but Walker was a black scribble separated from the rest of us by thick red lines. Natalie showed us the picture later and said this was actually healthy. Daniela was processing the separation as protective. Understanding that distance from Walker kept her safe. She was learning to feel secure again, even while dealing with what happened. 3 weeks passed in a blur of therapy sessions, hospital visits, and paperwork. Then the court date arrived for Walker's long-term placement hearing. Ruby and I sat together in the courtroom, but it felt like we were miles apart. She kept twisting her wedding ring while I stared at the wood grain on the judge's bench. The prosecutor started by describing Walker as a danger to others, listing every incident we'd reported. Each word felt like a knife, but they were all true. Our lawyer didn't dispute the facts, just asked for the most appropriate treatment. Dr. Dorsey took the stand next. He explained Walker's diagnosis in clinical terms, describing the neurological differences that affected his ability to feel empathy. He recommended long-term residential treatment with intensive behavioral therapy. When asked directly, he stated that home placement would put Daniela at continued risk of serious harm. His words were careful but clear. Walker couldn't safely live with his sister. The judge asked to hear from Walker himself via video link from the hospital. Walker appeared on the screen wearing a hospital shirt, sitting perfectly still. The judge asked simple questions. Did he understand why he was there? Because I broke the rules. Did he understand he'd hurt his sister? Yes. Did he feel bad about it? The doctors say I should. Every answer was flat and emotionless. When asked if he wanted to come home, he just shrugged. The judge reviewed all the reports for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. Finally, she looked up and announced her decision. Walker would be placed at Pine Ridge Residential Treatment Center, a specialized facility 2 hours away. We'd have supervised visits twice a week and family therapy once a week. The placement would be reviewed every 6 months, but she warned us to prepare for a long-term arrangement. Ruby started crying quietly, while I felt nothing but numbness. Moving day came a week later. I loaded Walker's clothes and toys into boxes, while Ruby labeled everything with his name. The facility had sent a list of approved items. No sharp objects, no electronics with internet access, no strings or cords over 12 inches. We drove the 2 hours mostly in silence. Walker sat in the back playing with a puzzle cube, not looking out the window once. Pine Ridge looked like a cross between a school and a hospital. Locked doors with keypads, high fences, cameras everywhere. But they'd tried to make it less scary with colorful murals and a playground visible through reinforced windows. Walker's room was small but clean. A bed bolted to the floor, a dresser that couldn't tip over, a desk with rounded edges. I helped him arrange his things while a staff member watched. Walker organized everything methodically, grouping his clothes by color, lining up his books by size. He tested the mattress, checked the closet dimensions, examined the window locks. When we had to leave, he didn't ask when we'd visit or when he could come home. He just waved and went back to organizing his shelf. Jade Hansen met with us before we left. She ran the behavioral program and had worked with kids like Walker for 15 years. She explained their system used clear consequences and rewards to teach appropriate behaviors. Every good choice earned points toward privileges. Every rule violation meant losing points. She said Walker was smart enough to learn the system quickly. The goal wasn't to cure him, but to teach him to function safely in society. Our first week without Walker at home felt completely wrong, but also weirdly peaceful. I kept walking past his room expecting to see him there. But Daniela started changing almost immediately. She stopped checking behind doors before entering rooms. She started sleeping through the night without waking up scared. She laughed at cartoons again and asked for second helpings at dinner. Her whole body seemed to relax in ways I hadn't realized she'd been tense. Ruby and I didn't talk much about how quiet the house felt. 3 days later, the phone rang during dinner, and it was Jade calling from Pine Ridge to tell me Walker had gotten another kid in trouble for smuggling candy from the cafeteria into their room. The other boy was younger, and Walker had convinced him it would be a fun game to break the rules together. But when staff caught them, Walker immediately blamed everything on the other kid. Jade said when they confronted Walker about manipulating the younger resident, he didn't show any guilt or shame, just seemed mad that his plan didn't work. She explained this was pretty common behavior for kids with his condition, and they'd be working on it in therapy. But I could tell she wasn't surprised at all. The next morning, Ruby told me she'd made an appointment with a therapist for herself because she needed help dealing with everything. She'd found someone who specialized in parents of kids with behavioral problems, and her first session was that afternoon. When she came back, her eyes were red from crying, but she seemed calmer somehow. She said the therapist helped her understand that Walker's brain was different from birth, and accepting that didn't mean she was giving up on him or being a bad mom. It meant she could stop blaming herself for not fixing something that wasn't fixable the way we wanted it to be. 2 days later, we had our first family therapy session over video with Walker at the facility. He sat in a chair next to Jade while Ruby and I huddled around my laptop at the kitchen table. Walker answered all the questions with the right words, saying he was sorry for hurting Daniela and understood why he needed to be at Pine Ridge. But there was no feeling behind any of it. Jade pointed out afterward that this was actually progress because he was learning what responses people expected, even if he didn't feel them naturally. She said for kids like Walker, learning to mimic appropriate emotions was sometimes the best outcome they could hope for. That night at bedtime, Daniela climbed into my lap and asked if Walker was sick. I struggled to find words a 4-year-old could understand without scaring her more. After a few tries, we settled on telling her that Walker's brain worked differently, and he needed special help to learn how to be safe with other people. She seemed to accept this and asked if he would get better. I told her the doctors were helping him learn, but avoided making promises I couldn't keep. 3 weeks after Walker arrived at Pine Ridge, Jade called to say he'd earned his first privilege for following all the rules consistently. He got an extra 30 minutes of computer time each day for educational games. She said he seemed pleased when they told him, but it was hard to tell if he was actually happy or just recognized he'd achieved a goal he'd been working toward. The whole conversation made me realize how much we analyzed every tiny reaction from Walker now, looking for signs of normal emotion that probably weren't there. That weekend, I was cleaning out Walker's room to turn it into a playroom for Daniela when it hit me hard. I found his Little League trophy from last year and remembered cheering at his games, teaching him to throw a curveball in the backyard. All those normal dad moments I'd looked forward to were gone. I wouldn't teach him to drive or watch him graduate or dance at his wedding. The future I'd pictured for my son had completely disappeared and been replaced with supervised visits and behavior charts. I sat on his bed holding that trophy and let myself feel the grief for the child I thought I had. The next facility report came 2 days later and said Walker was following every single rule perfectly and earning privileges faster than most residents. But they noted something concerning in their observations. He showed zero homesickness and never asked about coming home or when he could see us next. His only interest in family visits was that they were required to earn certain privileges. Other kids cried for their parents or got upset about being away from home, but Walker treated the facility like a puzzle to solve, not a place keeping him from his family. During our next supervised visit, Walker handed me a card he'd made in art therapy. It had a drawing of our family and said, "I love you, Dad," in his neat handwriting. For a second, my heart jumped, thinking maybe he was starting to feel something. But afterward, the art therapist pulled me aside and explained he'd been prompted to make the card as part of the session and had copied what another child wrote on theirs. She said he'd asked if making the card would earn him points toward his next privilege. 3 days later, Daniela started back at her regular preschool with a whole safety plan in place. Mrs. Henderson had assigned her a special buddy teacher who knew about the situation with Walker and would keep extra watch over her. Daniela was nervous that first morning, but came home smiling and talking about playing with her friends again. Seeing her start to be a normal kid again made everything else feel worth it, even though it hurt. That night, Ruby and I sat down with our bank statements and investment accounts to figure out how to pay for Walker's treatment. Insurance covered almost nothing for residential psychiatric care, and Pine Ridge cost more than most people's mortgage each month. We had to sell some stocks we'd been saving for the kids' college funds and cash out part of my 401k early, which meant huge penalties. The financial stress on top of everything else made Ruby cry again, but we didn't have any choice. The psychiatrist at Pine Ridge called me 3 days later, saying Walker had admitted during their session that he still thought about hurting people every single day. He sat in her office describing these thoughts like he was talking about what he ate for breakfast. She wanted to increase his medication dose and add a mood stabilizer that might help with the impulses. I listened to her explain how Walker had drawn pictures of kids getting hurt, and when she asked why he drew them, he just shrugged and said it was what he thought about. The new medication made him tired at first, and the facility said he was sleeping 12 hours a night, but still following all their rules during the day. 6 weeks into treatment, they scheduled our first family session where Daniela would join by video from home with Ruby while I went to the facility. Walker sat across from me in the therapy room watching the laptop screen where Daniela appeared holding her favorite stuffed animal. She immediately hid behind Ruby when she saw Walker's face on the screen. He watched her with that same blank look I'd seen so many times before, while the therapist tried to get them to interact. Daniela whispered something to Ruby about being scared, and Walker just tilted his head like he was studying an interesting bug. The therapist ended the video part after 10 minutes when Daniela started crying. That week, they started teaching Walker about emotions using flashcards with faces showing different feelings. Jade showed me how he'd memorized every single card perfectly and could name happy, sad, angry, scared, surprised without hesitation. But when she asked him to show her what happy looked like on his own face, he just stretched his mouth into something that looked more creepy than happy. She explained his brain didn't process emotions the same way, and he was basically learning to copy what he saw without actually feeling it. I found a support group for fathers dealing with kids who had serious behavior problems and went to my first meeting that Thursday night. The room had 8 other dads sitting in a circle, and when it was my turn to share, I explained about Walker. One man named Tom nodded and said his son was 16 now and had been in different facilities for 8 years after trying to burn down their house with his sister inside. Another dad talked about how his 12-year-old had been caught poisoning neighborhood pets and was now in juvenile detention. Hearing their stories made me realize this wasn't something that just got better with time. Ruby and I started couples therapy the next week because we were barely talking to each other anymore. The therapist helped us see we were both grieving in different ways and blaming ourselves for not seeing Walker's problems sooner. Ruby admitted she'd been having nightmares about Walker coming home and hurting Daniela again, while I told her about the guilt eating me up for missing all the signs. We held hands for the first time in weeks and cried together in that office. Walker sent a letter home that the facility forwarded to us with their approval. His handwriting was neat and perfect as always, and the letter said he was sorry for hurting Daniela and making us sad. The therapist had clearly helped him write it because it used phrases like, "I understand my actions caused harm," and "I take responsibility for my choices." At the bottom, where they'd asked him what he would do differently next time, he wrote in his own words, "Follow the rules better." Not that he wouldn't hurt his sister, but that he'd follow rules. 2 months into treatment, the facility director called to say Walker had become their model resident and was helping teach the rules to kids who just arrived. She explained he'd memorized their entire behavior system and could recite every rule and consequence perfectly, but she was careful to point out he did this to earn privileges like extra computer time and better snacks, not because he wanted to help anyone. She said he kept a chart in his room tracking exactly how many points he needed for each reward. Meanwhile, Daniela was working with Natalie on something called a safety book, where she drew pictures of all the people who kept her safe. She drew me and Ruby and her teacher and Natalie and her grandparents and even our neighbor who sometimes watched her. Walker wasn't in any of the pictures, and when Natalie gently asked about him, Daniela said he wasn't safe. It broke my heart, but I knew she was right, and it was good she understood that. Walker's teachers at the facility contacted us about moving him to their advanced classroom because he was finishing his regular work too fast and getting bored. They said his IQ tested in the gifted range, and he could understand complex concepts easily. The problem was he understood right from wrong perfectly on an intellectual level, but his brain just didn't connect that understanding to any feelings about it. He could explain why hitting was wrong and list all the reasons, but it didn't make him feel bad about doing it. The facility director scheduled a meeting with us to talk about long-term planning and what would happen after Walker turned 18. She sat us down in her office with a thick folder of information about supervised group homes and residential programs for adults with antisocial personality disorder. She explained that based on Walker's lack of progress developing empathy, he would probably need some kind of supervised living situation his whole life. The words hit me like punches as she talked about vocational training and medication management and how some people with Walker's condition could live semi-independent lives with enough structure and supervision. This wasn't what any parent wanted to hear about their 7-year-old kid, but I was starting to accept this was our reality now. The next week during our supervised visit, Walker sat across from me in the bright yellow visiting room and started asking questions about our house. He wanted to know if we still had the same alarm code and whether the motion sensors covered the whole downstairs or just certain rooms. He asked if we'd fixed the broken lock on the basement window and whether Daniela's new room had a lock on it. Jade immediately stood up from her chair in the corner and walked over to us. She told Walker those weren't appropriate questions and asked him to explain why he wanted that information. He just shrugged and said he was curious about home. The way he said it made my skin crawl because there was nothing homesick or nostalgic in his voice, just that same flat tone he used for everything. Jade ended the visit early and pulled me aside to discuss adding new safety protocols for any future home visits. 3 months after Walker entered the facility, we had our first big case review meeting. The conference room was packed with people holding thick folders and tablets. Dr. Dorsey was there along with Jade and the facility director, and Walker's psychiatrist and a woman from the state who oversaw residential placements. They went around the table sharing their reports and observations about Walker's progress. The psychiatrist said Walker had perfect compliance with medication and never missed a dose. The facility director said he followed every single rule and hadn't had any behavioral incidents in weeks. His teacher said he was doing grade-level work and participated appropriately in class. But when it came to discussing actual emotional development, everyone's tone changed. Dr. Dorsey explained that Walker showed zero development of genuine empathy despite months of intensive therapy. He could recite why hurting others was wrong and list all the consequences, but there was no actual feeling behind the words. Jade said Walker had learned to mimic appropriate emotional responses by watching other kids, but it was just copying, not real emotion. The woman from the state asked about discharge planning, and everyone went quiet. The facility director finally said Walker would need continued residential treatment for the foreseeable future and probably into adulthood. That same week, Natalie showed me a picture Daniela had drawn during her therapy session. It was our family with me and Ruby and Daniela all holding hands in front of our house. Walker was in the picture too, but he was inside a separate building that Daniela had labeled Helping House in her shaky 4-year-old handwriting. Natalie explained this showed Daniela understood boundaries in a healthy way and wasn't excluding Walker from the family, but recognizing he needed to be somewhere safe. She said Daniela was making excellent progress processing the trauma and developing appropriate safety awareness for her age. By December, Walker had earned enough points in the facility's behavior system for an overnight Christmas visit. The facility sent us a 12-page document with supervision requirements and safety protocols we had to follow. We spent 2 weeks preparing the house by installing locks on Daniela's door and setting up cameras in the hallways and common areas. We had to submit a detailed schedule showing where Walker would be every minute of his visit and who would be supervising him. Ruby cried while we installed the lock on Daniela's door because it felt so wrong to need to protect one child from another in our own home. On Christmas Eve, we picked Walker up from the facility with 2 staff members who would rotate shifts staying in our house during the visit. Walker got in the car carrying a small bag and buckled his seatbelt without saying anything. During the drive home, he stared out the window and answered our questions with 1 or 2 word responses. When we pulled into the driveway, Daniela was watching from the living room window and immediately disappeared when she saw the car. The visit went exactly according to the schedule we'd submitted. Walker woke up at 7 and ate breakfast while the overnight staff member sat at the table with him. He opened his presents in the living room while we all watched and said thank you after each one using the exact same tone and facial expression. He played with his new toys for exactly 30 minutes, then asked what was next on the schedule. When Daniela finally came downstairs, she stayed pressed against my leg the entire time and wouldn't look directly at Walker. He didn't try to approach her or talk to her, just continued following the rules and schedule perfectly. Christmas dinner felt like a performance with everyone playing their assigned roles. Walker used his napkin appropriately and asked to be excused when he finished eating and went to his room at exactly the scheduled time. There was no joy or warmth or connection, just compliance. The next morning, as we drove Walker back to the facility, he looked at me in the rearview mirror and said following rules at home got him better privileges than breaking them did. He said it completely matter-of-fact like he was explaining a math problem. The staff member in the passenger seat wrote something in her notebook while I gripped the steering wheel and tried not to show how much those words disturbed me. Over the next few weeks, Daniela started changing in ways that made my heart both break and heal at the same time. She started laughing again during cartoons and playing with her toys without constantly looking over her shoulder. She made friends at preschool and had her first play date where she actually left my side to play. Her stomach aches completely disappeared, and she stopped flinching when people moved too quickly near her. Watching her bloom back into the happy kid she used to be confirmed we'd made the right choice, even though it meant our family would never look the way we'd imagined. We settled into our new routine of weekly therapy appointments and supervised visits and safety plans and constant documentation. Our kitchen counter had binders full of treatment plans and behavior charts and incident reports. We had emergency numbers posted by every phone and practiced safety drills with Daniela once a month. Our family didn't look anything like what I dreamed about when Ruby and I first got married, but we were finding stability in the structure, and Daniela was safe, and that had to be enough. All right, that's pretty much the whole story. Thanks for hanging out with me. It always feels like catching up with a buddy when I do these. Come back next time if you feel like it.